of SCI. Gabrielle, thank you so much for passing that my contact information and everything along to him. His feedback was instrumental in putting together an excellent product. So a lot of people to thank. And then finally, without any further ado, LifeWorth leading leadership team, Gabrielle and the rest of the team, thank you for being here. Thank you so much. Wouldn't be here without you. And then finally, to my wife and family who have put up with seeing this presentation multiple times and all of my other dive presentations. So with the thanks done, let's get into some altitude diving. So what are we going to talk about this evening? So we're going to go over what is altitude diving, how the physics of altitude diving is different than what we do here at sea level. What are some of the physiological effects that we will see change as we go to altitude? And then how do we plan for these effects? How do we conduct safe diving? How do we ensure that we remain safe and can enjoyably embark on our wonderful underwater journeys at altitude? And then finally, we're going to talk about a couple interesting dive sites that I found, nowhere near a cumulative list, but a couple of places that I found interesting. I'd like to take our first altitude photo here that we're looking at. This is a photo credits to Benjamin Hadfield, shared by Mr. Jim Gunderson to us. So truly appreciate that. That's one of the spires on the bottom of Lake Yellowstone. So we'll get a chance to see those a little bit more. So geothermally formed chimney. So it was geothermal gas coming up and building up those spires, and those reside on the bottom of Lake Yellowstone. Bucket list item for me to see one day. So what is altitude diving? Altitude diving is recreational diving at altitudes of 1,000 to 10,000 feet above sea level. So what we'll have here is just a quick video to show what we're looking at. Again, at altitude, what are some of these opportunities? So let me get in here. It might, we're using YouTube here, so here we go. So credits to Blue Azul or Azul Blue YouTube channel. She has some great content and there, so I recommend that you look her up on YouTube if you get a chance, if you're interested. So diving in Yellowstone Lake, just below 8,000 feet above sea level. So some of the items that we'll talk about a little later, the really intriguing things here that I'm really looking forward to experiencing. We have the spires, the geothermal activity under the water. Again, we're looking at here some impacts to visibility there, but overall it's from the geothermal activity, but just a completely different, very different environment to be diving in. So again, why would we altitude dive? A chance to explore new places, and this just gives us that new area to dive within our means, to dive within our training, to go seek out new and interesting places to explore. So we will move on from there. All right. So now that we might be interested in at altitude, what changes? So what are we talking about when we say that there are significant changes between sea level and altitude? So the physics of altitude diving really starts, the primary gas laws that we're looking at is Henry's law. So as a reminder for everybody, Henry's law, the amount of any given gas that will dissolve in a liquid at a given temperature is proportional to the partial pressure of that gas. So how does that apply any differently at sea level? So when we're talking about atmospheric pressure less than 1 atmosphere, nitrogen will want to come out of solution more rapidly than it will at sea level. So as we reduce that atmospheric pressure, that enables that gas to come out of solution more rapidly. So that can significantly affect us, as that is one of the primary causes of DCS, is that nitrogen coming out of solution more rapidly then our body has the ability to process it. So how do we protect ourselves if we have nitrogen that is attempting to come out of solution more rapidly? And that is to dive more conservatively. So we always want a quantitative means to define conservatism versus the qualitative means. I might feel more conservative than someone else So how do we define conservatism? We'll get into that in a moment. So I'd first like to talk about, before we get into all the physics and the diving, what are some of the things that our body are going to go through different at altitude? So we've talked about how are the physics going to adjust. So how does our body react differently? So as we ascend in altitude, that oxygen in the atmosphere is going to be reduced as we're ascending to that reduced pressure. So one of the biggest factors we're going to experience is hypoxia as we begin to ascend. So if anyone's ever traveled to Denver or anywhere in the mountains, you'll notice that normal, regular activities can become more strenuous. And that's as our body is acclimating to an environment where the atmosphere is less dense with oxygen. So what we are feeling there is technically referred to as hypoxia. So less oxygen in the atmosphere. Some of those things can be fatigue, dizziness as our body reacts to that as we're going through. Some other factors once we get up to altitude that we can experience is due to that greater exertion that we are doing just to pull in that normal amount of oxygen that we would do in that hypoxic environment is we're experiencing that greater exertion. If we're working harder to do the same tasks, our body can become more dehydrated. We can have greater effects with temperature extremes. So if we're working hard to do a task, whether that's moving our dive gear to a dive site, conducting a surface swim out to where we want to descend at. All of these factors we can build up. It takes more exertion. We sweat more, and that can exacerbate heat and cold at altitude. So in a lot of cases at altitude, the temperature is lower than it is at sea level. So those are things that we have to plan for. So when we're looking at potential injuries around the dive site, those environmental injuries can be exacerbated at altitude. Finally, when we're looking at an overall term for how our body is reacting to altitude, once we've exceeded above 8,000 feet above sea level, we're experiencing something called altitude sickness. And that is the total cumulative effects of hypoxia, that dehydration, everything have effects on our body. To treat altitude sickness, the number one factors there is rest, hydration, and then if you are not acclimatizing to the environment at altitude, it is to descend down to a lower altitude, continue that rest and hydration cycle. And again, if you have a concern, if you feel that you are not responding even after you've descended, then it's time to seek out medical intervention for yourself or your buddy who's experiencing that. So physiologically, when we go, the key is to acclimate ourselves to that environment before we dive, and we will talk about that a little bit more further in the briefing. So as we acclimatize, there are some rules that we're looking to follow as we acclimate to that environment. And it's just anywhere as if you'd travel. We want to let our body get used to that environment. So the rule of thumb when we're looking at altitude diving is once we've ascended to that area around our dive site, we want to acclimate from anywhere from 12 to 24 hours. That allows our body to acclimate to a lower pressure, a lower ambient atmospheric pressure, where our body has a chance to off-gas that excess nitrogen. And so that's it. We're getting used to that environment, used to the lower oxygen, getting over that fatigue and dizziness as we acclimate. So just because we say we've flown to Denver or we've flown to a location, we are traveling to our dive site, that travel to the dive site can lead us to higher altitudes than we would if we were just where we were staying during the dive. So we have to consider the highest point of travel when we're going to our dive site. So if we have gone somewhere or we're here in Florida, we're not going to be traveling significant altitudes to get to a dive site on any given day. But when we're looking at this, if we have to travel anywhere between 1,000 or 4,000 feet to our dive site, if we have changed that amount of altitude, not above sea level, just anywhere from 1,000 to 4,000 feet of altitude change going to during that travel to the dive site, recommended 6 hours to wait before diving. 4,000 to 6,000 foot altitude change, mandatory 6 hours. And if we've ascended greater than 6,000 feet, we want a mandatory 12 hours before diving. Again, this is our body has to off-gas nitrogen as we change in that altitude. So just like we would conduct a surface interval, this is how to keep ourselves safe before we dive. And then final note here, if we're experiencing any altitude-related sickness or we're feeling fatigue, dizziness, we do not dive if we're experiencing those symptoms. Same thing if you're going on a dive boat after a lot of traveling, you just travel halfway around the world to get to a dive site. You're really excited, but you're just feeling under the weather. Best thing is to pause before diving. So same thing here. All right, so how do we plan for these dives? What is different than when we're planning a dive at sea level? So how we are going to quantitatively measure our being more conservative with diving, we're going to calculate a conversion factor. These conversion factors come from a ratio between what the pressure of millimeters of mercury at sea level, so that's 760 millimeters of mercury at sea level, over what our current pressure is at altitude. So what we're doing is ratioing those together and coming out with a conversion factor. So in this example, we have sea level 760 over 610 at 6,000 feet altitude, and that comes up with a conversion factor. So you can find resources online that will give you the exact pressure that you're at whatever altitude you're diving at. You can use that to come up with a very exact conversion factor to your dive site, or SCI has already done some of the math for us in altitude dive table 1. So what that does is per every 1,000 feet, we have a pre-calculated conversion factor that we can use as we're planning our dive. So this is where we start. This is that quantitative means of defining conservancy. Okay, so how are we going to apply this conversion factor for depth? So what we're looking at is creating a theoretical depth. We know that interesting object on the bottom of Lake Tahoe is about 60 feet down. We want to go down to 60 feet to see that. We don't want to, that is where we want to go. So how do we ensure that we plan conservatively? We're not changing depths, we're not changing anything, but what we want to, we're going to use that conversion factor to reduce that dive time scientifically to ensure that us and our dive buddies are planning the same dive conservatively. So what we see here, we see our actual depth from 0 all the way up to recreational max depth. And then we're going to see what our theoretical depth is going to be for our planning factors using our SCI dive tables. So if we were going to do a 60-foot dive at 6,000 feet of elevation, we would be planning a 75-foot dive on our dive tables. What that major adjustment is going to see is our no decompression limits. So again, what this is all down to dive planning. We are not changing our actual dive. Now that could be adjusted based on how much time we have, how long we're staying there, just like we would for any other dive. So we're going to take that conversion factor and we're going to apply that conversion factor. We can apply that conversion factor that we calculate ourselves, or we can use SCI altitude dive table 2, which has it generally laid out for us. All right. At this point, any major questions where we're at, if I've completely lost anybody? Yes, Jim.
I have one question.
Yes, sir.
And sorry for coming in late. I was running back from another meeting. So when you're working on this table or the previous table, how are you doing rounding?
So just as we would for any other dive planning, you always round up. So if I'm diving if where I'm going to is 57 feet, I'm going to plan at 60 feet. We're always going to round up. So we're always going to take the conservative step. Awesome.
Thank you.
All right. All right, so how are we putting this all together for our dive plan? So now we know our theoretical depth, but there's a couple other factors that we need to plan for to round out our total dive planning. So we're not only going to just affect our depth and our no decompression limit that we're going to adjust to be conservative with, we're going to apply that conversion factor to our safety stop and to our ascent rate as well. So a quick example here. So our planning ascent rate, we all know 30 feet per minute is a safe ascent rate when we're diving at sea level. we go to altitude, we're going to apply that conversion factor to our ascent rate as well. So we use 30 feet per minute as our baseline. We're going to divide that by our conversion factor. So if we are going to be diving at 6,000 feet above sea level, that conversion factor from table 1 is 1.246. We divide that, that gives us an ascent rate of 24 feet per minute. So we're slowing our ascent rate. So we're spending more time ascending up to our safety stop. For safety stops at altitude, so anytime we're conducting an altitude dive, our safety stops go to 5 minutes from 3 minutes. That's across the board, 5-minute safety stop. But we adjust our depth based on our conversion factor. So normal safety stop of 15 feet, conversion factor divided by a conversion factor gives us a safety stop at 12 feet. So instead of a 15-foot safety stop for 3 minutes, we're going to be doing 12 feet for 5 minutes. Again, adding that additional time for our body to off-gas that nitrogen, because when we get back up to atmosphere, our body will attempt to off-gas more nitrogen. So we're reducing that opportunity for DCS. Finally, I will touch on decompression. If we want to dig in more into decompression to get into this further, highly recommend taking an altitude class where you can go in further detail on this. But again, we're looking at our theoretical depth for our decompression stop, again, using that conversion factor. Again, awesome resource, SCI Dive Table 3. And if anyone's looking for these dive tables, they are in the standards and procedures SCI standards and procedures manuals in the back in the altitude diving section, or if anyone's, you can get them from your altitude diving class, or if anyone is really interested in getting them, you can contact me and we can look at getting you a copy. All right. So let's run through a full practical dive on how we would plan an altitude dive. Very high level here. So we can compare a sea level dive to a dive at Lake Tahoe. So Lake Tahoe is sitting just over 6,000 feet above sea level. So we're going to round that up to 7,000 feet using our tables. Again, always rounding up when we're using our tables. So at sea level, conversion factor of 1, we want to go to a depth of 60 feet. So again, we will be diving to 60 feet in Lake Tahoe, but we're applying our conversion factor to get that quantitative conservative factor for diving. And that comes out to be a planned depth of 77 feet. So if we look at our 60-foot mark in our air dive table or altitude dive table 2, that gives us a theoretical depth of 77 feet. So when we go to our SCI dive tables to plan our dive, just like we would anything else, our no decompression limit for a 60-foot dive at sea level is 51 minutes. At 77 feet off of our regular air diving tables, that gives us no decompression limit of 32 minutes. So our safety stop, 15 to 20 feet for 3 minutes. At altitude, safety stop 12 to 17 feet for 5 minutes. And then finally, our ascent rate at sea level, 30 feet per minute. Ascent rate at 7,000 feet is going to be 23 feet per minute. So again, much more conservative dive profile. So how do we put this all together here, looking at this together? So looking at our tables. So again, not adding any additional complexity to this. It's a lot to wrap your head around. We are using a conversion factor to give a theoretical depth, and that allows us to plan a more conservative dive. So here's our depth at our dive at sea level. So we're finding our depth, 60 feet. That gives us 51-minute no decompression limit. So when we're looking at altitude here in the yellow, so we said 77 feet was our theoretical depth. We round up to 80 for the table, and that gives us our no decompression limit of 32 minutes. So that is, in a nutshell, altitude diving. There's a lot more to it. There's a lot of ways that you can continue this when you're looking at multi-level repetitive dives. Again, I encourage you to take that altitude diver course. So does anyone have any questions about planning a dive at altitude? Okay, awesome. So now that we've talked to physiological effects, we know that how our body could react at altitude. Now I really want to go over what are some cool places that we can go and look at altitude. This is the real reason why we want to get this additional training to always dive within your limits and within your training. So first place I found online that really intrigued me is Clear Lake in Oregon. Clear Lake is a volcanically formed lake. So a lava flow dammed up portion of the mountain where rainwater collected, rain and spring water collected. So the depth of this lake, max depth around 50 feet. And the really cool item that you can see on here are some preserved trees that are still growing out of the bottom. So you still have some of the forest that's residing there, and you can go down and you can dive along with these trees, dive through there. Again, we have some freshwater algae. The really cool thing about this lake is that you have over 100 foot of visibility within the lake. So just if you look at some videos online of this, I highly recommend that. It's just crystal clear, absolutely gorgeous. So really intriguing. So this lake is just over 3,000 feet above sea level. So not a major conversion factor here. So you get a chance to do some good diving there. But again, major concern, 41 degrees is the water temperature. So definitely going to want to have some good exposure protection, potentially looking at that dry suit diving. All right, the one that I've talked about a couple times, Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming. So the depth for the dive sites here in this lake, you have less than 35 feet to in excess of recreational dive limits over 150 feet. Again, rather chilly lake, around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And this dive site is in excess of 7,000, almost 8,000 feet above sea level. So this is definitely a dive site we'd want to acclimate to, which is a perfect place because there's so much to see in Yellowstone. If you haven't been, I highly recommend it. Here, what are we looking at here? So we have the spires that we saw during at the beginning of the presentation, geothermally formed chimneys that are sitting on the bottom that we can look at. And additionally, we're seeing over on the far right-hand side of the slide is our geothermal vents where we might be in a 40-degree lake, but we're releasing near boiling point water into that lake. So again, super interesting, cool things to see that you only get to experience in a couple places in the world. And then final dive site here, Homestead Crater in Utah. Very interesting spot. Actually, I got directed to this. That popped up, I think, in a feed on Facebook. So this is a volcanic crater that is filled with water that's still geothermally heated. So conversely to the other sites here, the water temperature is in excess of 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So not really worried about exposure protection here. You'll max out around 65 feet in depth. So a great place to train. Elevation, almost 6,000 feet above sea level. So again, a little bit in contrast to some very all natural dive sites that are out there. A little bit reminiscent of some of the springs and caverns that we have down here in Florida. But would be a very interesting spot to dive, and I would love to take a stop off there. So again, a couple interesting spots, nowhere near a cumulative list of places to go dive. There's a lot of them out there, but just a couple places that I found intriguing. So to really come to wrap things up, to come to a bit of a conclusion here, we've talked about what is altitude diving, and what it's anything between 1,000 feet above sea level up to 10,000 feet above sea level. What physics apply here? So we've talked about Henry's law and how our major concern here is how nitrogen will be coming out of solution at a much higher rate at lower atmospheric pressure, which we will be above anywhere above that 1,000 feet above sea level. Physiological effects and how altitude of sickness can impact us and our buddies, signs and symptoms to watch out for, and some general treatments. Again, if you're feeling heavily fatigued, if you don't feel like yourself, you feel like it's a strain to do any normal activities, it just means you need to take a little bit more time to acclimate. And just like in anything, we dive to have fun and to enjoy it. And if we're having to stress and push and we're not feeling well, then that doesn't set us up well for success there. So again, to watch out for ourselves and our dive buddies. Dive planning, again, we're not using some complex new set of tables to plan our dives. What we're doing is using that good planning about understanding where our dive site is, how we have to travel to get to that dive site, and then developing our conversion factor and just using our standard air diving tables to plan. And then where should we go? I mean, there's lots of locations, almost limitless out there that I've seen that we can pull to look at from there. So with that, I will pass it over and see if for anyone, if we have any questions, comments for that. But that is my research on altitude diving.
Let's give Chris a big round of applause. Yay, Chris. Can you go back to your credit slide and
yes.
just a little shout out, because we do have some special guests here with us who missed the beginning. And so we are so appreciative. Jim is here with us, and he actually asked a question earlier. And to me, it just says a lot about how our focus with Scuba Educators International is really on education. The fact that we have so many people from the very top to those of us who are in the trenches, who are focused on education, who are focused on safety, who are constantly working to become better versions of ourselves. The fact that Jim is here and taking time out of his schedule and also provided feedback along with Robin and Dora says so much. And so we thank you. And Chris, thank you for your service in the Army, and thank you for your service now with Scuba Educators International and with Life Worth Leading. And you are extremely active on our leadership team, and we're really grateful that you're part of us. Anyone have any questions for Chris? Because this was a lot. Yes.
I do have a question. First, Chris, well, congratulations. Amazing presentation. It was very easy to follow, great pace, very good use of your slides, very good complementation of the information, good flow. So I will rank that a 10 out of 10. Okay. So congratulations on that. Very, very good. And really interesting topic, which I didn't know a lot about. So at the beginning, I had a lot of questions, but you were answering those questions along your presentation. So that was great. But my only question is, when we do our dive planning, so is very common for all of us to plan our dive, but in reality, when we go in the water, usually we use our dive computers, right? So what are the limitations of dive computers on altitude diving? I was checking my dive computer, that the one that I usually use is an integrated one, the Maris, and it doesn't have the capacity to program the altitude. It has like pre-programmed 3 different altitudes, so I will need to go to the manual and check what that means exactly. But what do you know about the use of computers during the dive at altitudes? What will be your recommendations on that?
So I had very similar questions to this. So not being an altitude diver myself, the Robin and Dora from Kaizen Scuba sent me the altitude diver manual as a reference after they had given me some corrections. So a huge shout out to them to thank you. So going through that, they did mention that. So they said that really review your computer's manual. And if you don't feel comfortable diving that, or you don't feel like that's giving you the feedback that you want, then it's always best to dive a gauge, or you could dive gauge mode on the computer to that. If you don't know how to use those functions, that's what I would do personally. If I didn't feel like my computer was giving me good feedback on that, I'd probably go to gauge mode and just run my tables completely for that. For the actual computers though, it says that in many cases, you need to ensure if you can set an altitude, or if it's automatically setting atmospheric altitude for your ambient pressure of where you're at, then that will give you that feedback. So Anna Marie, thank you. Yeah. So, and I'm not sure what computer you have, but that sounds like a solid one there. But again, it's one of those, you either set it beforehand, you ensure you set that range. But again, always recommend to review your tables before the dive. That way, at least what your no decompression limit is based on your time, so that you can verify if your computer is within the range or not. But again, the altitude course, I'd always go back to an instructor on that would give a better answer.
It looks like Jim has some
Thank you, Chris.
information to add to that as well.
Can I jump in and dovetail into that?
Of
Please.
course.
All right. So, and again, I'm gonna echo Victor. And Victor, you stole one of my questions, so well done. So again, Chris, great job on the presentation. Your presentation was smooth. It flowed well. The graphics were good. They were spot on. So well done on your presentation, sir.
Thank you for the pre-review that really got it to that level. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely, my pleasure. Okay, so and Anne Marie was exactly right. There are some computers that adjust to altitude automatically, or you have to just, you push the calibration button and it calibrates exactly to the bar that you're at. She's diving a Shearwater Perdix 2. I dive a Ratio IX3M, and it's an automatic calibration. So it doesn't matter. I can dive Lake Yellowstone on one weekend and then go dive Glenda, which is almost a 2,000-foot difference, and it automatically calibrates. So it's convenient. Other computers have a sea level, a 1,000 and a 5,000 foot setting. Some don't at all. So that varies from computer to computer to computer. So if you're diving with an analog gauge, the capillary gauge will actually read a little deeper than you really are, but that's the only one that really compensates for the altitude. So if you're diving a Borden tube analog gauge or another style, the analog gauges are less reliable and less accurate when you're diving altitude. So that's my input on that.
No, awesome. No, I know it mentioned a little bit in the manual, but wasn't going to try and pull that off for this one. So thank you so much for the input.
Yeah, absolutely.
Does anyone else have any questions for Chris? We've got some newer divers who are here with us as well, some from our current class.
Awesome.
Any questions?
I've got a couple other questions, but I don't want to steal the stage if anybody else has
no.
questions.
We'd love to hear more questions from you, Jim,
Please.
while we're waiting on others. Go ahead.
Okay. So this one is a very loaded question, and you may or may not know the answer to this. So you defined altitude as 1,000 to 10,000 foot. Why are those parameters set that way?
So I don't have an exact answer, and I remember reading on this one. It's about the ratio, and so I know in excess of 10,000 feet, it's the pressure exceeds such a point where you do need to was considered a technical diving, more technical diving above 10,000 feet. So if you are above 10,000, like if you want to go dive Lake Titicaca in Peru, Bolivia, definitely that is outside of the realms of recreational limits. But I cannot remember off the top of my head about how we set the 1,000 to 10,000.
That's exactly it. It has to do with oxygen concentration, but you're exactly right. Anything above 10,000, now we're talking technical dives and custom blends for your back gas.
Gotcha.
And then a follow-up question: that when you're at altitudes less than 1,000 feet, say you're diving a lake that's at 800, can you use the conversion factors there?
I can imagine that you'd still be able to use the same conversion factor. So that's, again, the table won't read it, but you can calculate your own conversion factor, and that will give you a more accurate dive. So
beautiful. All right. And then you mentioned in another slide, altitude sickness was defined above 8,000 feet. Is that a hard and fast 8,000 feet?
No. So altitude sickness is completely defined by someone's metabolism, how you react, your body. Your body is different than mine, is different than everybody's. So based on your metabolic rate, your ability for your body to process oxygen, to off-gas CO2, all these different factors. I mean, all the way down to your body composition on what part of what tissues are going to handle nitrogen different than others. So again, that is something. It's a great point that I didn't fully touch on. There is that altitude sickness affects everybody slightly differently. It will affect everybody at different rates in different areas. You could consider that 8,000 range is more like kind of like how nitrogen narcosis might affect somebody. Someone might not react one time. They go up to a dive site above 8,000, 9,000 feet. They may feel fine. They go back 2 times, 3 times later, and all of a sudden now they're feeling really, really bad. Again, it's how your body is at any given day. So altitude sickness is a very variable item.
Perfect. Beautiful. Love the answer. Okay, and then a follow-up question that I'm going to let's talk about a scenario, and the elevations might change based on the individual scenario, but this is one that comes up on a fairly regular basis. I live at sea level, theoretically. I live at 5,100 feet, but let's just say I live at sea level. Okay, and this is true because when I was a research diver at the University of Hawaii, we would do a lot. I lived in Hilo, and we would do most of our dives over on the Kona side, and we would dive obviously at sea level.
Yeah.
But then when we're traveling back, we went through Waimea town, which is at 5,300 feet.
Mm-hmm.
How do we, as divers, account for that travel time? Or if you're in the mountains and if I'm going from 5,000 feet up to Lake Yellowstone, which is the 7,900 feet, but I'm going over a 10,000 foot pass, 11,000 foot pass. How do I compensate for those things when I'm traveling and through those altitudes?
So that is before we dive, we want to. So this is it would be you want to consider that ascent, that total ascent, that change in altitude that you're looking for. If you are ascending above that, you want to. If you're changing in altitude, that's where these would come in. The recommendations for your time prior to diving. So if you have a change in altitude that's between 1,000 and 4,000 feet. So if you're living at 2,000 feet above sea level and you're going up to a lake that's at 7,000, that change there, you want to recommend to wait for 6 hours prior to diving. So that would be basically your interval prior to diving with that change in altitude.
Let's reverse that. We're at our 7,000 foot lake, and we've done our dive, and it's time for us to go home, but we've got to go over a 10,000 foot pass. How are we going to feel that?
That I would say you need to wait that period of time, just like you would before getting onto an aircraft. You need to conduct that wait time prior to that travel, because you need to let your body off gas that nitrogen before putting that major pressure change through your body.
Beautiful. No, that's exactly right. Yep, that's exactly right. And just so everybody knows, in that our protocol, when I was at the University of Hawaii, when we would get done with our last dive of the day, we'd note the time, and we'd start calculating, because according to our DSO, dive safety officer, we had to be D-divers before we could start the climb on the tables. So we would start our last surface interval time whenever we got done with the last dive. We'd go in, rinse our gear. Usually we'd end up going to some pizza joint there in Kona, eating pizza. So we had enough off gas time. Then we took the low road, so we even had a little more off gas time before we started the climb, because it was a sudden change. You go from sea level to 5,000 feet in about 10 miles.
Yeah. Paakaloa training area, just south of Mauna Kea.
Yeah, you know it. You know where I'm talking about. Yeah, and we were forbidden to go over Saddle Road. We could not go over Saddle Road. Yeah. We could go there when we're going to the dives, but not coming back from the dives.
Aha. You're still off gassing.
Oh yeah, because and Saddle Road's at, I think the high pass of Saddle Road is at 8,000 or 7,000 feet. Yeah,
it's way up there.
It's way up there. So
just for everybody's edification, so there is another dive table that associates our letter group for our repetitive dive group with times, and that goes a little bit deeper. That is further into the altitude diver course and in the manual for reference. So that is something that may bring some clarity to it, but it helps out define that time of when we've off-gassed enough if we're traveling between altitudes.
Awesome. What I'd like to do right now is get a picture of everyone. If you will all turn your cameras on if you can and give an okay sign. we're going to do a quick picture. Okay, can't see myself. All right, ready? Awesome. 1, 2, 3. Smile. 1, 2, 3. Ha ha ha, nice. All right, awesome. Thank you all for being here. If anyone has follow-up questions they want to ask Chris, feel free to do so. Jim, what an honor to have you here. We're so thankful. And again, leadership team, thank you for being here, and our students, and Colby, Chris's wife, showing support as well. Super glad you're
My
here.
pleasure.
Yeah, thank
My
you.
pleasure.
All right,
And I
everyone.
suppose I'll ask if it's okay, Gabrielle.
Yeah.
If anybody's got any questions of me since I'm here, do you have any questions of me and SEI?
When's the annual drive trip to Yellowstone?
There
It's
you go.
typically in July.
Okay,
Truly,
July.
yeah, that's true.
Yep.
We can plan on that.
We've done it the last 2 years. The first year we did it was kind of a pilot. It was there was a grand total of 3 divers that went. It was just kind of a test run to see how is this going to work the kinks out. Last year we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 divers last year, so it doubled. So we are planning on doing it again. There are 20 now. There are now 24 known extinct spires.
Oh, awesome.
Yep, yep. There's 24 known extinct spires, and it's. I will say this: it's a long surface swim to get to the drop point, but then you drop down and you see some spires, and you swim your way back to shore. So it's not bad, but they are fun dives. And how often do you get to say you're diving in the caldera of an active volcano?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's again, bucket list item. Super excited to hopefully
Yes.
take advantage of one of those.
Yeah, so we typically do these in July. These are led by one of our instructor trainers. His name is Benjamin Hadfield. He is the kind of the subject matter expert on those spires. He's got these suckers mapped and photographed, and he's very, very knowledgeable about them. So
Awesome. We'll have to bring our dry suits there. I want to go to
yes,
the 95-degree temperature.
Yeah.
dry suits are highly recommended. So, but any other questions? Again, I don't want to steal Chris's thunder because this is all about Chris, but I thought I'd open it up for the
Yeah.
opportunity.
Thank you.
No,
Leadership
absolutely.
team, any questions for our head person at Scuba Educators International? Anyone want to say anything to Jim while he's here? Really?
Thank you for being here.
Well,
And
yeah,
Okay.
the only
Here we
question that I had was, when are we planning this trip to the location in Utah? That was the one that really
yeah.
really neat seeing those.
So we can
95 degrees.
Yeah, that
we
sounds
can plan it
perfect.
anytime. Here's the deal with Homestead Crater. It's hot. It is hot. It is hot. So your dive time's limited because you get overheated.
Like taking a hot bath.
I would not get
Yep,
overheated.
exactly.
Ronnie,
And
would not get overheated.
yep, and because of the heat, it's a higher bacteria load. So those are things to consider. So eardrops, highly recommended. As soon as you get out of the water, get right off, get some eardrops in, so you can deal with so we can avoid that extra infection. But yeah, it's a nice dive site. It's very warm. Shorts and a t-shirt, as opposed to a few hours north and it's dry suit weather.
Crazy. I think we should do
So.
both.
Yes,
Okay.
agreed.
All right. Yeah, this
Well-
team is amazing for adventure. So
Will you be at DEMA in Orlando next year?
Absolutely.
Awesome.
we are
Yep.
all planning to be there.
Awesome. Yeah,
Yes.
we have an expanded booth at Demon next year, and yeah, lots of good stuff coming on the horizon.
Well, thank you for all you're doing. And for the leadership team, there are some really exciting new things happening with SEI. I'll be sending an email soon to everyone, but also in our next Dive Master and Instructor Institute, we'll talk about some super cool things that are happening. So again, thank you for everyone being here tonight. And Chris, excellent job. Just excellent.
Well done,
I'm so
Chris.
proud of you. You are already a great instructor and you're going to become official really, really soon. If you liked his presentation tonight, come back in a week. He will give his final instructor presentation, and the topic is
Search and recovery.
very good, search and recovery. Chris is also tasked with heading up our team. We are partnering with a local agency that is doing search and rescue and recovery of people, and so we're working with them on law enforcement, primarily law enforcement in rural counties, and Chris is heading up that team. So all the more reason to come back next week. And lots of great comments in the chat box, by the way, and everyone is just saying great job. So thank you.
Thank you so very much, everybody, for coming and showing support. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Welcome to the club.
Yeah. Almost there.
Almost, yeah. You're at the door.
Yes.
Next week, he'll become official.
Good times.
So will Anna Marie. Yes. All right. And Scott, he's not with us, but anyway, thank you, everybody. Good night.
Have
Thank
a
you very
great
much.
night.
Good job, Chris.
Thank
Good
you.
night, all. Good job, Chris.
Night.
Appreciate it.